The latest chapter of the tariff drama unfolding today with Trump agreeing to pause tariffs on Mexico, but import tariffs are still in place for Canada and China. For more, we're bringing in Dan Mahaffee, CSPC Eisenhower Fellow and Dr. Scholl Foundation President. Dan, it's good to see you. So maybe start high level, Dan, because listen, we had a lot of news today. We had a lot of headlines and cross currents that traders, investors had to try to navigate. But maybe big picture, Dan, what is Trump trying to accomplish with these tariffs or threat of tariffs? What's his objective? And start maybe with Mexico and Canada.
Good afternoon, Josh, and thank you for having me, and happy to talk with you about all this. Certainly you see with his goals of the tariffs, it's two-part. One, immediately the questions of immigration and fentanyl drugs. He wants it for a border security tool, but as he see in his truth posts and his own statements, he also sees this as the longer-term answer to bring manufacturing back, and as he says, bring about a golden era for the American economy.
It's interesting, Dan, because it feels like, and stop me if you disagree, that Trump thinks about tariffs, it's kind of evolving how he thinks about the tool. In other words, when he talks about Mexico and Canada now, it doesn't sound like his emphasis, at least, is tariffs because he wants to address these issues of economic competition. Now it sounds like he's often emphasizing, I want to use them as a tool to address these kind of broader geopolitical issues and concerns, whether it's border security or drug trafficking. What do you think about that?
I think agree. That's a good point. He's specifically citing national security legislation that he's using to impose these tariffs. But yes, that is correct how he's tying it to these issues of security, other geopolitical issues. And I also think, and whether it'll be effective, history will tell us, but sending this message that if I'm going to do this to a country like Canada or Mexico, imagine what I could do to China or another that is more of a geopolitical concern going forward.
Dan, do you think Trump perhaps, I ask you to play a guessing game here. Do you think he looks, at least some of the initial reaction responses, he gets these threats, whether it's Colombia, right? I mean, you saw that story. We all were, that was kind of a remarkable exchange that took place. I mean, Trump says, listen, there's immigrants who come here illegally. Colombia, you're going to take them back. President of Colombia says, I'm not. Trump threatens tariffs. Suddenly, Colombian government, within a matter of hours, does a reversal, says, okay, they'll let the deportation plans land. Then with Mexico, Dan, he threatens tariffs. And the president of Mexico apparently now willing to send 10,000 troops to the border. I wonder if Trump looks at that and says, okay, they're actually working as a tool. I'm kind of getting my way. I have leverage here.
Yeah, he sees that definitely. That's a good point, those two times, as well as saying, also, look, the voters, the American people endorsed my view. That's what the voters want. At least I'm saying this as President Trump probably sees it. So he sees both the international efficacy of these previous instances. Now we'll have to see if these countries ultimately do follow through. But he sees that as well as the sense he has that the voter is behind this. Now we'll see how long that is once if the pain of these tariffs do get through. But clearly, too, the next question will be, does he also wonder, does this get his way with these countries, or does it ultimately push countries to do business elsewhere or look for other partners? And that's where I think it could be counterproductive on some of these geopolitical concerns long term. How
do you think, Dan, we're waiting to see, he's scheduled to speak with Canada's Trudeau, and of course there the relationship has been, contentious, Dan. Let's leave it there. How do you see that playing out? Because right now we have these headlines, listen, U.S. and Mexico, you got to pause, right? How do you see it playing out with Canada potentially?
I think, well, particularly, too, personally, between President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau, since this is a family program, I'll just leave it at contentious. You're right there. But the relationship between them is not strong. Look, Trudeau is also a weak leader within the Canadian government. Elections looming. He's on his way out. I think that makes it harder to get that kind of action like we did with Mexico, where President Sheinbaum said she's going to send, as you said, 10,000 troops to the border. I think it's harder for Canada to move on that And I think Canada is also a bit taken unawares, even though immigration and fentanyl have been growing problems there, although not the extent that you have with Mexico.
And I have to ask you, Dan, we talked Mexico and Canada. I haven't gotten to China yet. I'm curious how you think that drama plays out. Would you bet new levies do get, enforced there, Dan, or no, there's some type of grand bargain that Trump and Xi Jinping can work out? And what would such a bargain look like, Dan? What would be the possible variables?
Yeah, that's a $10 trillion question when you look at what the variables are. Obviously, a lot of it comes down to manufacturing in China, agricultural purchases from the U.S. Those were all components of his past deal with China. I think the issue there, one, as I said, is that he is doing some of this action to show China that he can play tough. Two, he does want that big deal. But three, longer term, I think the problem for the president and any deal with China is that many Republicans are actually far more hawkish on China than the president is, and he would have to deal with some of the concerns within his own party before he could even get to some big deal with Xi Jinping.
And Dan, while we are speaking, my friend, I got news dropping. Justin Trudeau just posting this on X, says he had a good call with President Trump, that Canada, he says, is implementing our $1.3 billion border plan, reinforcing the border with new choppers, technology, and personnel. He says nearly 10,000 frontline personnel are and will be working on protecting the border. Says Canada is making new commitments to appoint a fentanyl czar. We will list cartels as terrorists, ensure 24/7 eyes on the border. Also signed a new intelligence directive on organized crime and fentanyl, and will be backing it with $200 million. Proposed tariffs, he says, Dan, will be paused for at least 30 days while we work together. That, according to Justin Trudeau. Your thoughts, reactions to that headline, Dan?
Well, I think it shows that this pressure that they're using and getting a similar deal like with Mexico, hopefully for markets providing some calm, but again, a reminder that we could just be buckling up again in 30 days unless we really see some progress in the standards that this president once met.
Who do you think, Dan, ultimately has the leverage between U.S. and Canada? It was interesting because you'll get different takes on that. I've seen some economists say, listen, Canada ships out more than 20% of their GDP to the U.S. Besides Mexico, there's no country in the world that even comes close to that. But how do you see that leverage playing out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's sort of the leverage that we have over each other is it's sort of you win together or lose together. There's no two economies, I think, that are more integrated than the U.S. and Canada, and how you play out this leverage. Look, I think the United States, we certainly have leverage in the technology and financial fields and the other stuff. But when you look at the car industry, the resources, energy we get from Canada, it's really important for the U.S. to have a good economic relationship with Canada to be competitive on the global stage. So I think while we do enjoy some leverage, I think a trade war between partners like this is ultimately lose-lose on the global stage.
You think Trump sees them purely as leverage when it comes to tariffs, Dan, or he sees them as kind of multifaceted? They're leverage. They're also, he obviously believes revenue raisers, national security. They can encourage domestic manufacturing. Do you think he thinks of them as just sort of all of the above?
Yeah, I think he sees them as a policy Swiss Army knife, for lack of a better term. They can work on these sort of short-term negotiations, threatening to jack something up. Longer term, too, he does speak, though, of using them to bring manufacturing back. Depending on the conversation, you'll hear him say, can you, I don't think the math works, but replace some level of income tax with tariffs. All these things he does talk about and sees them. The question will ultimately be, does that economic vision fit in a globalized economy that really isn't one that reflects what it was like when there was that golden age of tariffs in the 19th and early 20th century.
Dan, thanks for helping us make sense of the news and the breaking news. We appreciate it.
Great to talk to you.